question for you. What if the key to unlocking your yield potential lies just below the soil surface? Hi everybody, Jim Schwartz with Beck's Hybrids. Today I want to tell you a little bit about something we're engaging in here at Beck's called root reveal. One of the questions I get a lot is, why in the world did you even start down this path to dig a little bit deeper on roots? Well, the beginning of this really started with my youngest son, Stephen, who was getting his master's degree under Dr. Fred Below at the University of Illinois. And at that time, he was working with a young man named Scott Foxhoven. Today, it's Dr. Scott Foxhoven. But at the time, Scott was doing some research around root size and fertility placement, trying to understand if there was a relationship between the size of a corn root and placement of fertility. And he learned some very interesting things. And as we began to think a little bit deeper about it, we also began to think, I wonder if root architecture may have a play in the differences between hybrid responses. But let me show you how I really got down this path. I've had a number of conversations with my youngest son, and as we were talking, I began to realize that, today a lot of farmers farm around 43,560 square feet per acre. That's an entire acre. But after some of these conversations, I began to wonder if farmers in the future will farm less than that, maybe 11,700 square feet per acre. And you may be wondering, that is crazy. Where did you come up with that? Well, let me explain a little bit deeper. One day I was driving with my son and we were talking about some of the new technology that's coming on the market. Specifically, in his case, it was at John Deere. But imagine these are corn plants, and in between the rows, we've got weeds. So some of the new technologies that have come onto the market today, one of them, for instance, John Deere's version, is called See and Spray. And so See and Spray, the concept is you can come and spray individual weeds after you apply a residual early in the season and kill those individual weeds, use less herbicides, save on costs, etc. Another new technology they've released is something called Exact Shot, where you can put fertility right next to the plant. And I began to think, well, today, farmers are farming 43,560 square feet per acre. But if I have technologies where I can spray plant by plant or put fertility by the plant, why in the world wouldn't I come in and think about spraying a fungicide on an individual corn plant, putting my fertility right next to each plant? In fact, why would I farm the whole 43,560 square feet? Why wouldn't I farm maybe an 8-inch band, which is 11,700 square feet? Because I could band fertility here and I can spray a fungicide or spray foliar nutrition plant by plant and or put other fertility right next to the plant. That's why I believe in the future, we may be farming less than a full acre. But the other reason is as society tells us what they're interested in, one of the things you hear a lot today is things like carbon intensity scores, carbon scores, things like that. And so if that's the case, if you farm less, if you till less ground, or you are more efficient with your nitrogen or your other fertility, you're probably going to get credit for that. So that's why I began to think there may be something to farming less than a full acre. And I remember I asked my son, I was like, hey, now that we have all these technologies, why in the world don't we start thinking about farming plant by plant? And he didn't answer, and I looked over and he's smiling. I'm like, you can't answer that question, can you? And he goes, no, Dad, I can't really answer that question. But we had another aha here at Beck's that really led us down this path of trying to understand not only root size, but root architecture. A young man named Travis Burnett, our agronomist here in Indiana, and I were having a conversation one day, and it led to another discovery. We had a hybrid called 6622 that we had planted in our 400 bushel plot. Now we were told never plant that hybrid above 28,000 plants per acre. But interestingly enough, we hit 400 bushel 2 years in a row with that hybrid, planting between 36 and 42,000 plants per acre. Well, how does that work? Well, here was kind of the aha moment we had. When we planted that hybrid in 30-inch rows, those plants are much closer together. Now, the interesting thing is that when roots touch underground, we know that there's some kind of signaling that goes on, whether it's a biochemical signal, a root exudate, we're not exactly sure. But there's signaling that goes on underground. And so when you plant those plants in that 30-inch row width, they're much closer together, and therefore you get that root touching and probably get that stress signaling. However, the way we hit 400 bushel was we planted in 10-inch rows. And when we did that, even at higher populations, we spread those plants out. It allowed that hybrid, which had a very horizontal root architecture, to express itself quite differently because it didn't have plants crowding each other and that horizontal root architecture wasn't touching. And therefore, we were able to hit that 400 bushel at these higher populations because we were in 10-inch rows. And that really got us thinking there may be something more than simply root size in this equation. We got thinking maybe architecture does have an impact. So one of the things we wanted to understand then is if you think about the architectures, we believe there's 3 architectures, but think about this. If we have a more vertical root architecture and one that's more horizontally oriented, let me ask you a question. If I band my fertility, would you expect to see a greater response from this one or this one? Conversely, let's say I coulter my nitrogen in the middle of the row. Would you expect to see a greater difference between this one or this one? And adding on to that, knowing what we know about roots touching, if I increase my populations, do you believe, knowing about the root touching thing, do you believe that this architecture would respond a little differently to increased populations than this one? Those are all questions we began to ask ourselves and really led us down the path to studying root architecture. Now the question is, how did we do that? Well, the way we did that was our innovation team found a gentleman in St. Louis, Missouri. His name is Dr. Chris Topp. Dr. Topp works out of the Danforth Center there in St. Louis. And he does a lot of research around roots, nitrogen assimilation into the roots and root genes. And we began to think he probably has learned some things that would help us understand a little more. And so we went and visited Dr. Topp. He was growing roots in something very similar to this. And so we asked him, can we use that idea to help us understand corn roots? And he said, of course. And so here in a minute, Kevin Colbert's gonna give you a little deeper dive into that process. But when we uncovered it, what we found was there are indeed dramatic differences between that root architecture. On my right is a very vertical root architecture. So go back to what I drew on the board. Imagine if I band my fertility, do you think I'd get a different response with that one versus this one? Because underneath this hybrid, there's not a lot of roots where you might band your fertility. Think about things like poorly drained clay soil. This hybrid has a different morphology, very fine, smaller hair root types, whereas this one has much larger roots. Well, if I'm in a poorly drained clay, this root might rot a little quicker, lead to a little more crown rot, whereas this one may be better suited to access oxygen closer to the soil surface. Additionally, think about a long-term no-till where we may have nutrient stratification. This hybrid has the vast majority of its roots in the narrow 8 to 12 inch profile. This one is, again, much more vertical and deeper. Do you think this one in a nutrient stratified environment might perform differently than that one? It's based on what we discovered in these root boxes and based on some of our understandings from things like our 400 bushel plot that we chose to begin to dig a little bit deeper on root architecture to help us understand how those root architectures may impact some of the management decisions you make on your farm, specifically around 3 things: population, nitrogen or fertility placement, and then also stress tolerance or stress management. Because we know that you're not going to change the things you do on your farm to match the hybrid. So if we can do a better job of understanding how root architecture impacts those decisions, we may be able to better match the hybrid to your management practices on your farm and de-risk some of the events that happen over the course of the year. So I'm going to let Kevin Colbert come now and tell you a little bit about what's the process we created to develop these root boxes.
Okay, we're ready? So to start the whole process out, what we're doing is we're taking the bladder out of the tank. We put the supports back in, start with the empty cage. You'll see some felt in the bottom. That is to keep the material from falling through the holes. We can still let the water through, but the turfus that we use does not fall through the holes. So we put the felt in, make a little plate here for the well where the tank dips down, just to keep everything flat on the bottom. And then as you'll see in here, we have this cage almost done, but we're putting the fishing line in here. The goal of that is to catch the roots as they grow into the quadrant that they grow through. So if there was no line in here, when we would drain the material, the root system would just collapse on itself and you wouldn't get the structure that what we need. So we're gonna go ahead and lace this last row right here on top. So what we wanna make is a grid system in here. So we're gonna go through all of the bars. Okay. So if you'll notice here also, we put more layers at the top than we do at the bottom because all those fine roots that are at the top, we want to catch those, know exactly where they are. This box now is ready to wrap, put the sides on, fill it up, and start it growing. So we've got the box full, we've watered it in. You can see the moisture in the top here. We're gonna plant seed directly into this material. Today we're gonna be planting some 6374. So we'll get a tag made here. We're gonna plant 2 seeds in this just to make sure we get a plant that germinates, and then we'll take out the one that we don't need. So we're gonna try and get dead center in the box. We'll put those in. 1.5 to 2 inches, and we're ready to go. 75 days later, we'll be ready to open this up and look at some roots. So, we're gonna plan on opening this box today. Water's been shut off for a couple weeks, so we're gonna expose the roots and see what we've got. If you see in here, we've got the irrigation lines that are all here. We're gonna cut this plant off. The top part is nothing that we need at this point. Get it out of the way. Can remove the irrigation. Okay, we'll move it over to the conveyor and get it opened up. If you want to see, before we start cutting this open, you can see all the roots, how they've grown to the plastic and then headed down through there. So massive roots even clear down at the bottom. What we're gonna do is we're gonna start, I'll walk around it, we're gonna start cutting at the top here, letting the material run out the top into this conveyor. The goal is to not let those roots move anywhere. So wherever they grew inside the box, we want to keep them there if possible. So we'll start at the top, let that material come across, and then when we get closer to the bottom, we can pull the bottom out and start draining it. So we'll get started on that. No nutrients or anything, no soil in this. It's all just a clay-based material. It's actually used for baseball fields in most cases because it absorbs moisture real well, and then it'll dry out very, very easily as well. So when these are set up, we're gonna run water on them 3 times a day through our irrigation system. The amount of water, I'm not exactly sure on, but I know it's enough to keep that plant going, sustain it. Those nutrients get flushed out very easily, so we have to keep that nutrient fed in there constantly. The amazing thing is, we shut this water off 3 weeks ago, or approximately 3 weeks ago, and you can still see how much moisture there is in there. So those plants pull out a lot, but this stuff will really hold a lot of moisture. So if we do miss a watering somewhere, it's not the end of the world. Just by the way, this stuff will hold moisture and fertilizer for that plant to use when needed.
Yeah, so basically what we're doing is 3D modeling through photogrammetry. So we'll do a full rotation at 3 different heights and take around 100 pictures of each, and then we use software called Agisoft Metashape to align all of those pictures as it goes around, and then we can create point clouds and 3D mesh models and textured models of all the root systems.
So what have we learned through our research up to this point, and where are we going with root reveal research in the future? Well, we began to think how we might do research. It felt natural for us to reach back out to one of the original folks that we had conversations with, and that was Dr. Fred Below at the University of Illinois, and partner with him on a couple of research projects around roots. The first project was trying to understand, does root architecture impact things like nitrogen management? And then the second study we did with Dr. Below was, how does population and root architecture interact and impact hybrid performance? So those are two studies we initiated this past year. Let's take a look at what we learned. So the first question we wanted to understand is, first of all, can we actually classify these hybrids according to their root architecture? In the end, what we discovered was we really focused on three things: surface area, root angle, and root mass. And we asked Dr. Below's team to look at 8 different hybrids that Beck sells currently and see if, first of all, were there statistically significant differences in these hybrids as it related to surface area, angle, and mass. And as you can see on this chart, indeed, there were very large and statistically significant differences between those 8 hybrids in all 3 of those categories. So the first question that we wanted to answer was, are there differences? And the answer was yes. Then what we wanted to do is take these 3 areas, surface area, angle, and mass, and we created what's called a SAM rating. This is a way to begin to characterize roots for these different traits. And as we thought about it, we wanted to understand then, does SAM rating influence a hybrid's response to nitrogen management? So that was the study that Sam Leskonich at Dr. Below's lab, who's now getting his PhD in this topic, began to research. And when we set up the protocol, what we did is we said, let's look at 3 different nitrogen rates and or application methods. So we looked at 120 pounds up front. That simulated our low nitrogen environment. We looked at 180 pounds all up front. And then we looked at a blend, basically 120 up front, followed by a side dress of 60. So a total of 180, but this would simulate our placement differences. As we began to examine the data, one of the things that Sam found was, interestingly enough, when we looked at the 120 pound rate, so that would simulate our low nitrogen environment, what we found was those hybrids, when you look at the SAM rating, those hybrids that had a narrow root angle, so when they had an N in the middle, a narrow root angle, they responded best in the low nitrogen environment. Those hybrids with the narrow root angle responded best. Well, that's interesting, but is it intuitive? Does it make sense? Well, let's think about it. How does nitrogen move in the soil? Nitrogen moves primarily with soil water, and it moves very vertically. So does it make sense that an architecture that's maybe a little more vertical but goes a little bit deeper would perform better in a low nitrogen environment? In this case, in this data this past year, yes, it did. Here was another interesting observation that Sam discovered when he did the research. The hybrids that responded best in this environment, where we side dressed nitrogen in the middle of the row, interestingly enough, those hybrids that responded best had a wide root angle. In other words, this component right here of the SAM rating, they had a wide root angle. Well, does that make sense? Well, imagine a wide root and Coulter applying my nitrogen in the middle of the row. Sure, that actually seemed to make sense. And again, those hybrids that responded best to this side dress application had a wide root angle and tended to have a large mass. So they would have been, we would have used a SAM rating of large, wide, so large surface area, wide angle, large mass. Those tended to respond best to that side dress application. So this was just the first year of data with the University of Illinois. It was one location replicated 6 times. So this year, when we think about what's next for this study, we're going to continue it at the University of Illinois, but we're going to expand it to multiple locations, more of a clay soil, and then also prairie soil, and also a little more of a silt loam soil. But the second study we did with the University of Illinois was, how does population interact with the root and root architecture? Now, one of the things we discovered, which is very, very interesting, is that as planting populations increase, for every 1,000 plants root size decreases 2.5%. Back in, I believe it was 2014, Dr. Barnhart at the University of Illinois also had done some research around this concept, and what he found mimicked this data almost exactly, is that for every 1,000 plants, you increase population, root size decreases 2.5%. Let me ask you a question. What have we been doing to our planting populations over the course of the last 20 years? They've been going up. In fact, they've been going up around 400 plants per acre per year. Well, what does that mean? That means, in essence, we have been decreasing our individual plant root size 1% per year for the last 20 years, or 20%. Would that have an impact on things like your fertility placement and your response to fertility placement? We believe that the answer is yes. The other thing we asked the University of Illinois to do was begin to look at above ground plant mass and below ground root mass. And so, as you can imagine, as we increased our plants, so this would be populations, this would be lower to higher. As we increase planting populations, above ground root mass increased. Interestingly enough, as we just laid out, individual below ground root mass decreased. Now, understanding that as you increase your planting population, you will have more roots in total, but when you looked at the data that the University of Illinois developed, what it taught us was total per acre root mass remained essentially flat. So the key here in this understanding is that as we increase populations, above ground plant mass goes up, below ground root mass per acre remains the same. So that means we're supporting more plant mass with the same per acre root mass, but less per plant root mass. So then the question is, if that's the case, if as I increase my populations and my roots get smaller, right, would that have an impact if I culture applied nitrogen? We believe the answer is yes, and that's what we're going to continue to do research and try to discover around this topic. So as we look forward to where we're headed with Root Reveal and the research, this year we're very excited. We've initiated a number of studies with some different folks. At the University of Illinois, we've taken that plant population study as well as our nitrogen placement and management study, and we've combined them into one large study. Additionally, this year, for the first time, we're working with Dr. Daniel Quinn at Purdue University to initiate a study on banding versus broadcasting fertility relative to root architecture. What we're going to look at, we're going to see if a vertically oriented architecture will respond differently to broadcast fertility and banded fertility versus a horizontal root architecture. Additionally, then we've initiated 2 new studies in practical farm research around some of these concepts, banding and broadcast, and then fertility and nitrogen placement, as well as population management. So there's a lot to learn. I love to tell people that my life axiom is every day I live, I learn how dumb I was the day before. And I can tell you, as it relates to roots, the more we uncover, the more we know that we have to learn. It is a world that's as yet undiscovered, and that's why we believe that in the future, the key to unlocking the potential on your fields may lie with what happens below ground. Thanks for joining us. Look forward to more research coming out of Beck's on Root Reveal.